In a hypothetical Washington that runs a little hotter than the real one, the meeting starts with a line that's meant to land like a slap. Mr. President, and I use that term very loosely. Ilhan Omar is standing in front of the resolute desk with her arms folded, voice sharp, posture rigid, refusing the chair like it's a trap. She's talking the way people talk when they've already decided they're the brave one in the story, and everyone else is just an obstacle with a title. She thinks she's walking into a familiar kind of fight, the kind where volume and moral certainty do most of the work. And at first glance, the room looks like it's set for exactly that. Trump is behind the desk, but the vibe is wrong for a standard political spat. There are no aides typing notes, no photographer hovering for the cordial discussion shot, none of the normal stage dressing that tells you this is theater with guardrails. FBI Director Christopher Wray is off to one side with thick folders, and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem is holding her own stack, like she came to brief a governor during a hurricane. Two Secret Service agents are posted by the doors in that quiet, stone-faced way that says, "This isn't about feelings." Omar clocks the props, but she doesn't read them the way she should. She treats the scene like a backdrop instead of a warning label. She believes the summons is about her public stance on Gaza, her speeches, her interviews, her social media, the whole high-profile package. The call came from White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles that morning, and it was short, formal, and oddly specific about the time. Urgent national security matter. No explanation, no subject line, no friendly hint from a staffer who's trying to keep the temperature down. Omar assumes that vagueness is the tell, because vague is what bullies use when they want you anxious. In her mind, Trump wants a private confrontation so he can posture and threaten and maybe clip her wings. She comes ready to perform defiance because performance has paid her before. So she unloads, point by point, in the language of modern political combat. She calls him a bully, calls him weak, calls him the kind of old man who mistakes attention for strength. She throws in the crowd pleasers, the indictments, the ego, the resentment, the grievances, the scandals that have been litigated 1,000 times on cable. She leans forward over his desk, which is not how members of Congress usually behave in the Oval Office, unless they're trying to create a moment. In her mind, the moment is the whole point. Then Trump does the one thing that short-circuits the script. He doesn't react like a target. He doesn't shout back, doesn't fidget, doesn't reach for a quip to reclaim the room. And that absence of reflex becomes its own message. He watches her the way someone watches a person argue with a vending machine, like, "Sure, keep going. I'm not the one stuck here." Omar interprets calm as calculation too late, because calm is only comforting when you don't suspect the other person has receipts. When he finally interrupts, it's not loud, but it's final, like a judge ending a sidebar. "Sit down," he says, and the room suddenly feels less like politics and more like procedure. Omar hesitates because tone matters, and this tone is not a man sparring for headlines. He repeats it, still even, but with that hard edge that doesn't need volume to cut. He tells her, flatly, she's going to want to be seated for what comes next. That's the moment her confidence twitches, not because she's suddenly afraid of Trump's anger, but because she can't find the familiar doorway out of the situation. She sits, slower than she would like, still trying to hold her face in the shape of control. You can almost hear her mind searching for the angle, the statement afterward, the clip for MSNBC, the fundraising email. Trump leans forward and strips the story of the thing she's been holding on to. He tells her she's not there because he's offended by her tweets, not there because he's furious about a rally, not there because donors want vengeance. He says he doesn't care what she says about Israel in the way a man says he doesn't care about the weather, like it's irrelevant to the matter at hand. Then he drops the words that, in this fictional scenario, are meant to change the oxygen in the room: terrorism financing and immigration fraud. He pushes a thick folder across the desk like it has weight beyond paper. And he says he declassified it that morning, which is the kind of claim that either ends as a bluff or ends as a catastrophe. At this point, it matters how the story is told, because a story can imply without convicting. The file, Trump suggests, contains allegations and traces and patterns, the kind that can be interpreted in courtrooms and spun on television. He frames it as a case the government believes it can support, not as a verdict already handed down. He uses numbers, because numbers feel objective even when the interpretation is contested. He references overseas transfers, family connections, and intermediaries, because intermediaries are where doubt lives and where prosecutors hunt. Omar's mouth goes dry, but she tries to interrupt anyway, because interruption is what you do when you're trying to stop a narrative from settling. He doesn't let her. He motions to Christopher Wray, and Wray steps in with the neutral, practiced cadence of someone who has delivered too many briefings to enjoy the drama anymore. Wray lays out the premise as what the Bureau believes it has found, not as a signed confession. He describes wire transfers, structured amounts, dates, recipient identities, and a network that, according to Treasury designations, raises serious questions. He talks about a money transfer business, and he uses the kind of language officials use when they're trying to be precise without explaining too much. He emphasizes that sending money overseas to family is not, on its face, illegal, which is the sort of sentence you include when you know you're walking through a minefield. Then he pivots to what investigators claim the money may have touched on the other end, which is where the argument becomes radioactive. Wray references a name, Ahmed Noor, and describes him as a relative by marriage, a person of interest tied, in this scenario, to a flagged network. He mentions Tawakkal Express and says Treasury had designated it as connected to terrorism financing in 2023, and that investigators relied on that designation as a starting point. He describes the alleged movement of funds through channels that aren't always transparent to traditional bank compliance systems. He suggests that some downstream recipients were on watch lists or tied to bad actors, and he uses charts and photos the way briefers do when they're trying to make complexity feel simple. Omar, in this telling, insists she was sending money for family needs, and you can hear the desperation rising, because family needs is a phrase that can be true and still not save you. Wray replies with the line that bureaucrats use when they're implying knowledge without claiming mind reading. You knew, or you should have known. Kristi Noem takes over, and she is framed as the person holding the immigration file like it's an audit that found too many irregularities to ignore. She talks about biographies, interviews, forms, and the difference between a public origin story and the paperwork that supported legal status. She says, in this scenario, investigators believe there are inconsistencies involving a parent's status, overseas travel, and representations made in public venues. She references records from the United Kingdom and claims those records would contradict a narrative Omar publicly used. Omar starts to argue about wording, about what she meant, about what she said, about how people interpret trauma. Noem, in this dramatized account, answers with quotes and dates, the way someone answers when they want to make the discussion about documents instead of feelings. Then comes the part that, even in a hypothetical, is the most combustible: identity, names, and family ties. Noem suggests birth records and refugee camp paperwork might show a different surname, and she acknowledges, at least briefly, that records from war-torn places can be messy and contested. She claims investigators have corroboration, which is the kind of word that can mean anything from solid evidence to stacked inferences, depending on the case. She references marriage documentation from Minnesota, and she hints at allegations of a marriage that could have been used for immigration purposes. She doesn't say guilty in this version. She says pattern, and she says timeline, and she says questions that can't be waved away. Omar denies it, and the denial sounds smaller than her earlier bravado because this isn't a TV fight about ideology anymore. A third official, NSA Director Sarah Mitchell in this story, widens the circle to communications, and that's where the scene shifts from paperwork dispute into national security framing. She references a warrant and says monitoring was authorized under legal process, which is the kind of statement designed to quiet the obvious question. How would you even have that? She describes calls to Somali officials and frames the concern as coordination rather than casual conversation. She plays audio clips in the story, but importantly, the narrative treats them as purported recordings released in part, because that's how you keep the door open to dispute. Omar says she's allowed to speak with foreign officials, which is true in broad terms, and Mitchell counters that content matters. The argument becomes about whether the content was inappropriate, misleading, or worse. The alleged clips are described in cautious language, statements about timing, policy, and leverage that might suggest a divided loyalty in the most uncharitable reading. Mitchell points to pronouns we and they, as if pronouns can prove allegiance, which is exactly the sort of thing that makes skeptics roll their eyes. And that's where the story's tension can live without declaring a verdict. Is this evidence of something nefarious, or is it the government building a narrative out of ordinary political talk? Omar claims she is being targeted for being Muslim, a claim that, in the real world, would instantly polarize the debate. Mitchell replies that this is about actions and records, not identity, which is what officials always say, and sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's convenient. The room in the telling becomes a contest between competing interpretations of the same set of facts. Then Todd Blanche, the White House counsel in the scenario, steps in with a legal explanation, and that's where the tone turns clinical. He describes denaturalization as a civil process if citizenship was obtained through material misrepresentation, and he emphasizes the lower burden of proof. He talks about preponderance of the evidence, which sounds like legal jargon until you realize it means we don't need to prove it beyond all doubt. He frames it as a path that can be pursued regardless of political noise, because courts tend to care more about records than motives. He references precedent, but he does it in a way that suggests inevitability, which is exactly the tone a lawyer uses when trying to push someone toward a deal. Omar says she'll fight, and Blanche says she can, but he implies the fight will be long and ugly. At this point, Trump comes back in, and he presents the choice like a businessman offering two contracts, one quiet, one loud. The story makes sure to keep it as an offer described by Trump, because that's how you avoid stating it as a documented policy move. He says, resign, leave, renounce, disappear, and control your narrative. Or refuse, and the administration will go public with allegations, filings, and a press conference that will set the country on fire. He frames it as mercy, which is the sort of word people use when they want power to feel like generosity. Omar says it's unconstitutional, and Trump says he's not forcing anything, he's just removing options. The meeting ends with a deadline and a warning, and the warning is delivered with the kind of calm that makes it feel worse. Now the story rewinds, because suspense needs context. 4 hours earlier, Omar is in her office doing what politicians do, prepping talking points, shaping lines, anticipating questions. Her communications director, Maya Hernandez in this version, is worried because National security is vague. Omar dismisses the concern, reading the summons as intimidation theater. She views Trump as predictable: provoke, threaten, bully, then retreat behind bluster when challenged. Her staff suggests getting more information, but Omar believes the meeting itself is the content. In her head, there's a camera, even when there's no camera. She instructs her team to tip off friendly media because the modern political ecosystem rewards anticipation. She imagines walking out of the White House to microphones, giving a crisp statement, and turning the day into a fundraising surge. She jokes about old men who yell, because humor is a shield when you want to appear unbothered. She rehearses how she'll stand rather than sit, how she'll interrupt, how she'll frame him as unhinged. She's not preparing to defend, she's preparing to attack. That distinction matters, because the person who prepares to attack tends to miss the possibility that they're not the one holding the leverage. Meanwhile, in the Situation Room in this scenario, Trump is doing something different. Reading. He sits with Ray, Noam, Mitchell, Susie Wiles, and legal counsel, looking through folders of alleged evidence. The story paints him as energized, partly because that makes him more threatening, and partly because it fits his self-image as someone who lives for the showdown. Ray describes how investigators say the case began, with Treasury flags, structured transfers, suspicious thresholds. Noam frames immigration issues as the legal foundation for citizenship challenges. Mitchell frames communications as a broader counterintelligence concern. The counsel frames options like chess moves, and the key move is offer her an exit before we light it on fire. The plan, as described, is cynical but neat. Don't tell her what it's about, let her walk in confident, then flip the table. That's not just about punishment, it's about control of optics. If she leaves quietly, the administration avoids looking like it's staging a public vendetta. If she fights, the administration claims it's simply responding to her refusal to take the private resolution. It's a trap built out of choices that all end in the same place, just with different levels of spectacle. Trump likes it because it's simple. Easy way or hard way. And Trump, in this dramatized world, always prefers a choice that lets him say, "You did this to yourself." At 2:30 p.m., Omar arrives at the White House with her head high, expecting a battle she knows how to stage. She has already seeded the media, and she imagines herself as the protagonist of a confrontation clip. She walks into the Oval Office and sees the folders, the posture, the cold setup. But she stays committed to her script. She refuses the chair, stands like she's on a debate stage, and launches into the prepared attack anyway. That's the fatal habit of modern politics. When you've rehearsed your outrage, you're tempted to spend it even when the room changes. Trump lets her spend it, because letting someone talk is sometimes the best way to show them they're not in control. When he finally says, "You done?" it's not a question so much as a signal that the performance has ended. Omar tries to continue because momentum is her weapon. Trump cuts her off with "sit down," and she feels the shift because power doesn't always announce itself with volume. Then the folder appears, the allegations appear, and the narrative becomes something she can't tweet her way out of. Ray starts laying out the alleged transfers, the designations, the downstream recipients, always with the careful phrasing that keeps it in the realm of claims rather than final truth. Noam lays out the alleged discrepancies in identity and family narrative, again in the language of paperwork and contradictions. Mitchell lays out the alleged calls and clips, and now the story is thick with if-true consequences. Omar leaves the White House without doing the triumphant statement she planned. Reporters are waiting, because she told them to wait. And now the wait becomes awkward. She walks past cameras like she's trying to outrun a thought. In the car, the story says, her mind races between denial and calculation. Bluff or not bluff, leak or no leak, fight or fold. She meets with lawyers, and the lawyers in this version tell her the same thing from different angles. If the government has even part of what it says it has, the best move is to avoid the public blast radius. But Omar can't stomach the idea of leaving under Trump's terms, because pride doesn't care about risk. Pride tells you you'll win the argument even if you lose the case. So she stalls. She doesn't call Ray, doesn't send a resignation, doesn't accept the quiet exit. She convinces herself that going public would be too reckless even for Trump, because surely someone would stop him. She tells herself the country wouldn't tolerate it, the courts wouldn't allow it, the media would see it for what it is. And that's the tension the story wants you to feel. At what point does a person's faith in institutions become a substitute for strategy? She is counting on a system to protect her from an opponent who claims to have found a way to make the system the weapon. That's not just arrogance, it's a particular kind of Washington gamble. Friday morning arrives, the deadline narrows, and the call comes. Ray's voice in this telling is calm and procedural. You have hours. The press event is ready. The decision is yours. Omar asks for more time, and Ray replies that time was the one thing she already got. She says she's not resigning, and she says it like a person trying to convince herself as much as the person on the line. Ray warns her the release will be worse than she thinks, which is exactly the kind of line that either turns out to be empty intimidation or turns out to be a nightmare. He hangs up, and the silence that follows is the sound of a door closing. The White House announces an urgent press conference, and the Capitol starts vibrating. At noon, Trump walks out to the Rose Garden podium with a lineup designed to project seriousness. He frames the matter as national security, and he uses the language of announcements rather than accusations, even though everyone knows the effect is accusatory. He says the government has concluded an investigation into Representative Ilhan Omar, and he references alleged transfers and alleged fraud. He gestures to Ray and Noam to present declassified evidence, but the story makes sure it's enough to persuade the public without exposing sources. That's how these moments often work in real life. A curated set of proof points meant to shape a narrative before the defense can respond. Reporters shout questions and Trump ignores them, because ignoring questions is part of his brand. The country watches, and the temperature jumps 10 degrees. Omar's office releases a statement calling it political retaliation, and to her supporters, that explanation lands instantly. But the story also notes that skeptics will look at bank records and timelines and ask uncomfortable questions, because even a politically motivated attack can still contain real contradictions. Democratic leadership responds with careful language, serious allegations, need for review, due process, because panic is bad politics and certainty is dangerous. The squad, in this telling, goes quieter than usual, not necessarily because they believe the allegations, but because defending the undefendable is a career killer. Moderates in swing districts start backing away because the soundbite writes itself. The story doesn't declare guilt. It declares the political reality of suspicion. In Washington, suspicion is sometimes enough to end you, even if you later win in court. Then the machinery grinds forward. Ethics committee statements, emergency reviews, public calls for resignation. Omar goes on television and denies. But denial on camera has a shelf life if new documents keep dropping. The narrative describes a denaturalization complaint being filed, because filing is a fact in the fictional universe, even if the claims inside aren't proven. Her lawyers argue selective enforcement, political animus, unreliable foreign records, and every other defense you'd expect. The judge, in this dramatized version, says motive doesn't erase evidence, which is a line that sounds fair and also brutal. The House votes on expulsion, and the numbers reflect not a verdict, but a fear of association. That's how institutions protect themselves, by cutting loose the person who draws the fire. From there, the story compresses time into a long, grinding legal slog. It describes months of motions, hearings, appeals, and the slow suffocation of a public figure under the weight of allegation. It describes a court finding by a civil standard because that detail matters. Civil findings can end lives without proving crimes. It describes immigration consequences as a chain reaction rather than a single dramatic moment. It describes the humiliation of a public fall without lingering on cruelty, because cruelty is what gets stories flagged and what makes audiences recoil. It ends with a bleak irony. The person who entered the Oval Office intending to humiliate Trump becomes the person used as a cautionary tale in Trump's speeches. And it leaves the viewer with questions rather than a courtroom verdict, because questions are safer, and because questions are what keep people watching. But let's be honest. The most interesting part of this hypothetical isn't the paperwork or the press conference. The most interesting part is the psychological misread at the beginning, the moment Omar assumes the meeting is about optics, when it's about leverage. If you strip away party labels, it's a story about power, ego, and the way modern politics trains people to treat every conflict like content. Omar walks in expecting to win the clip, because she has won clips before. Trump sits there expecting to win the outcome, because he's obsessed with outcomes even when he loses the moral argument. One side thinks the game is narrative, the other thinks the game is enforcement. And when two people play two different games in the same room, somebody gets blindsided. There's also a deeper question simmering underneath the spectacle. What happens when politics and national security are allowed to overlap without clear guardrails? In the real world, people should be skeptical of any administration that claims it has secret evidence and asks the public to trust the release it curates. People should also be skeptical of public figures who treat every summons like a stage and every warning like a bluff. The story's tension lives in that uncomfortable middle, the possibility that a case could be exaggerated, weaponized, or spun, and the possibility that some of the contradictions might be real enough to survive spin. That's why the narrative works as commentary. It doesn't ask you to believe, it asks you to notice. Who benefits from the timing? Who benefits from the framing? Who benefits from the silence? Who benefits from the frenzy? And then there's the subtle comedy that always haunts Washington, even in its darkest moments. Omar's team texts friendly reporters like they're ordering a camera crew for a product launch, because that's how politics is done now. Trump times a press conference like it's a season finale, because that's how he's always done power. Spectacle first, substance second, and then claim the spectacle as proof of substance. Cable hosts pretend to be shocked while secretly grateful, because nothing juices ratings like a story nobody can fully verify in real time. Lawmakers issue statements that say everything and nothing, because they want to sound responsible without committing to a reality that may change by the next news cycle. Even the phrase urgent national security matter starts sounding like a brand. So if you're listening to this as a long-form voiceover, the point isn't to walk away declaring anyone proven anything. The point is to sit with the tension that our politics now rewards performance so heavily that people can mistake performance for protection. What if Omar's confidence is less about arrogance and more about the learned belief that outrage is armor? What if Trump's calm is less about strength and more about the thrill of finally holding a cudgel he can swing with paperwork instead of tweets? What if the real villain in the story isn't a person at all, but the incentive system that turns governance into content and content into weaponry? And what happens to the country when those incentives meet the machinery of national security? In this hypothetical, Omar's fall becomes a precedent in the way big political falls often do. Not because it's clean, but because it's memorable. People cite it in arguments about immigration enforcement, about the weaponization of intelligence, about the blurred lines between oversight and allegiance. Supporters say it proves the system can be bent to punish dissent, especially when the target is polarizing. Critics say it proves nobody should be immune from scrutiny, especially when public narratives and private records don't line up. Both sides use it as a prop because both sides love a cautionary tale. And somewhere in the middle are citizens trying to figure out what's real, what's curated, and what's strategically incomplete. If you want the most unsettling question in the whole scenario, it's not, "Did she do it?" Because that's the obvious one. The unsettling question is, how would we know, quickly, either way? In a world where officials can release partial evidence, where opponents can call everything a hoax, where partisans treat every fact as negotiable, certainty becomes a luxury. That uncertainty is fertile soil for spectacle, because spectacle thrives when people can't resolve the story. It's also fertile soil for abuse, because power thrives when the public is confused and exhausted. So the story ends not with a moral, but with a warning disguised as a question. If the next administration, on the other side, used the same playbook, would you still call it justice? And that brings us back to the Oval Office, to that first misstep, that first assumption. Omar stands there thinking her media profile is armor, thinking her allies will rally, thinking outrage will bend the room to her will. Trump sits there thinking the folder is the weapon, thinking the deadline is the weapon, thinking the spectacle is the weapon if the folder alone isn't enough. In this hypothetical, the room is a collision between two kinds of confidence. The confidence of a person who believes the narrative protects her, and the confidence of a person who believes the institution protects him. One of those confidences collapses, and it collapses fast. And the audience, which is all of us, is left doing what we always do now, replaying the clip, arguing about motives, and wondering which parts were proof, which parts were spin, and which parts were carefully chosen to make us fight.